can tell Lydia was here playing with the microphone. As I've been getting ready for our Lenten series, Toward a Holy Death, I've been thinking a lot about dying. So this question at the beginning of our reading from 1 Corinthians stuck out to me. How are the dead raised? Paul asks it rhetorically to set up this section of his letter, but it's a good question. In fact, it's similar to this great book I read last week by Tom Long called What Happens When We Die. I don't know how he packed so much wisdom into 70-odd pages, but he did. Paul is exasperated with the Corinthians, but we all have this question, don't we? What happens when we die? How does life work after death exactly? This question is doubly hard because it's difficult for us to trust what we cannot see, and we cannot see what lies beyond death. We cannot know what resurrection is like in the same way that we know that water freezes at 32 degrees. We desire that kind of knowing, but it's not possible. That doesn't mean, though, that we haven't tried. Over the centuries, humans have developed several ways to think about what happens when we die, which Tom Long summarizes really well in his book. The first is that nothing happens. Death is the end of the line. The second is immortality of the soul. Our bodies end, but our souls are like a piece of life force or energy that gets released at death and reunited with its source, which is God. Our souls can never die. They are immortal. The third is reincarnation. The soul lives on in another body, in another life here on earth. There's also the resurrection of the soul. And when people say a corpse is just a shell or a husk, this is kind of coming from that perspective. This is the idea that our mortal self dies at death, but our soul lives on without a body. Finally, we have the resurrection of the body. Generally, this is what Christianity holds to be true. In the Apostles' Creed that we say at morning prayer, we have, I believe in the resurrection of the body. Now, if this sounds totally bananas to you, hear me out. This was my initial reaction too. But spending some time in this passage from Corinthians has given me a new perspective. First, to be clear, Paul is not talking about zombies here. Resurrection is not the same thing as resuscitation. Secondly, the resurrection of the body doesn't mean that every single piece of our DNA that's ever existed somehow gets mashed back together on a heavenly plane. But here's where this belief comes from. We know that bodies are an essential part of being human. We need bodies to be our full selves. It is through our bodies that we speak, we listen, we give thanks, we move through the world, we hold one another's hands, we express love and affection. You need a body to laugh. You need a body to cry. Many of the things that make us human happen within and through our physical selves. Now, the Corinthians didn't like bodies, and particularly corpses, but not because bodies are evil, but because they can be a pain in the neck, especially in a world without modern healthcare or sanitation. I mean, bodies can be a pain in the neck in a world with modern healthcare and sanitation. But you have to remember that God fashions our bodies in love and carefully knits them together in the womb. God scooped up a handful of pebbles and dirt, made us look like God, and called the result supremely good. Our bodies are not bad. Theologian Carla Works says, Paul is convinced that God made this casing and longs to redeem it. And that redemption, that fullness or completion, happens in and through death, strangely enough. The larger point is this. Human beings don't have bodies. We are embodied. You cannot be a human without a body. You are not you without your body. You are not an amorphous blob stuck in a bodily container that gets liberated from that container to float on a cloud when you die. I'm sorry to break it to you. I do believe, though, that our resurrected bodies will be meaningfully liberated from suffering and pain. We keep the scars, but not the pain. Now, this does not mean that our bodily mechanics will be exactly the same after death as before death. Jesus, in his resurrected self, he ate and he drank, and people could touch him, but he also walked through locked doors. People sometimes recognized him and sometimes didn't. And anyway, if I lost you back there, here's your chance to tune back in. Here's what I know for sure. First, you and I have only experienced a small part of what it means to be fully alive. Second, we are changed in death somehow, and yet retain some essential parts of our embodied selves. And third, through death, God transforms our bodies into a more complete version of ourselves. Here's what I mean. We don't get an equation for life after death. Instead, we get wisdom from the natural world. Some of Paul's language here is a little bit grating. It is Paul, after all. But I think what he's trying to say is that our humanity is incomplete until it is made complete in resurrection. Here's how Eugene Peterson renders this section of Paul's letter in his Message translation of the Bible. He says, there are no diagrams for this sort of thing. We do have a parallel experience in gardening. You plant a dead seed, and soon there is a flourishing plant. There's no visual likeness between a seed and a plant. You could never guess what a tomato would look like by looking at a tomato seed. Are the tomato seed and the fruit both real? Yes. Is a tomato seed before planting a fully complete tomato? No. Is a human being before death a fully complete human being? Christianity says no. Is our life here on earth immensely beautiful, meaningful, and purposeful? Yes, absolutely. But is this life all there is? No. On the other hand, is the significance of our life reduced only to what happens in the great by and by? Definitely not. But what if our own death is less like a finish line and more like a labor and delivery room? Think about it. A baby in utero is aware of certain things about reality. She has a body, she can move around, she can somewhat experience her world. But her understanding of herself and the world around her is limited. It's dark in there. She can't laugh. She can't feel a cool breeze on a warm day. She can't hold anybody's hand. Her experience of being human is incomplete. Birth to this infant must feel like a kind of death. Her world as she knew it completely ends. She breathes with lungs now instead of through an umbilical cord. It's cold and bright. There's some continuity of her life before, like the familiar voices she heard in utero, the comforting smell of her mother, but not very much. We all know that she was made for life outside the womb, but she has no idea. She just knows that everything is different now, and her life in the womb has ended. I think our own deaths are similar. God carries us across the threshold of death into life beyond what we can presently imagine. We are fully known, fully ourselves, only in light of the resurrection. So what does this mean for us today? I think it means it's okay to have questions, curiosity, confusion, and doubt about death and resurrection. That's how we get this lesson, after all, with this question at the beginning of our passage. We will not have perfect answers, but we can explore the questions, and we owe ourselves that. It also means that death is not something to fear. When we are dying, in the words of one of my favorite deathside vigil prayers, we are laboring in new resurrection birth. Through death, God transforms our bodies into a more complete version of ourselves. It also means that God's new kind of life can only happen in death. When something around us dies, a relationship, a ministry, a job, it is sad. It also means that something new is being born. This is the dynamic called the Paschal Mystery, and it is the cycle that's at the heart of our faith. Keep your eyes open for and embrace these tiny deaths, because they are the seedbed of new life. And these tiny deaths will help us practice moving through the big death that is ahead of us all, the death that will be our birth into the never-ending reign of God. Death is part of the gift of life, but death is not the end of life. In the words of our prayer book, "For to your mortal people, O Lord, life is changed, not ended. And when our mortal body lies in death, there is prepared for us a dwelling place eternal in the heavens." My friends, the good news is that the Christ who was your Alpha will also be the Christ who is your Omega. Thanks be to God.